Laura Nader is professor of anthropology here at Cal, and she's been here since 1960. I should add she was also the first woman to receive a tenure-track position in the anthropology department. She received her PhD in anthropology from Radcliffe College, the Women's Coordinate College at Harvard University, which joined together with Harvard in 1999. And she worked there under the mentorship of Professor Clyde Kluckhohn, an American anthropologist and social theorist best known for his long-term ethnographic work among the Navajo and his contributions to the development of theory of culture within American anthropology. Her education included fieldwork in a Zapotec village in Oaxaca, Mexico, which nurtured her interest in law as it grows and changes in various societies. And this interest began within her own family, which stressed so much the importance of law and justice. Professor Nader has been highly influential as a voice in contemporary anthropology, and her books include Naked Science, Anthropological Inquiry into Boundaries, Power, and Knowledge, published in 1996, The Life of the Law, published in 2002 with Ugo Matai, and Plunder, Where the Rule of Law is Legal, published in 2008. So her expertise is indeed wide-ranging, bringing together the fields of cultural anthropology, comparative methods, law, dispute resolution, controlling processes, kinships, professional mindsets, the Middle East, Mexico, and the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are indeed in for a treat tonight to hear this presentation by Cal Professor Laura Nader. Professor.
I didn't set out to write a book about culture and dignity. The writing was sort of a process. It began many decades ago. But the impetus for putting it together as a book became urgent as a result of more recent happenings. And I outline these happenings in my introduction. The demonizing of Islam and Arabs that accelerated after 9/11. The bifurcated moralities of American politicians who claimed they were bringing democracy to the Middle East via the bombing of innocent civilians. After all, we are the civilized by virtue of the rule of law, not the rule of dictators. And by the way, the subtitle I would like to correct, Plunder when the rule of law is not legal, but illegal. When the rule of law is illegal is when you go to Baghdad and you send Brennan there and he makes up a legal system and applies it and says this is now the rule of law. Illegal by international standards. And this notion of civilization, we're bringing civilization to different parts of the world, is an old theme. I'm sure you're aware of it. But the voices of wisdom, truth, fairness, consequence were submerged in hysteria, the hysteria of Islamophobia, the Israeli drumbeat on Iran and nuclear, how they treat their women, the barbarians. President Bush had it partly right when he called Iraq War a crusade. I say partly because the other part of the story has to do with resources, oil in Iraq and the central Middle East, lithium and other minerals in Afghanistan. But it was the hypocrisy, it was the hysteria that caught my attention. And the willingness of so many of my countrymen and women to believe rather than to question. Now, we used to come home from school and my father would ask us, did we learn to believe or did we learn to question or think? So that was important to me. Why did so many Americans believe what was coming in over the TV and radio? So my introduction to this book is replete with examples of indignities and humiliations. The International Conference in Brussels on immigrants to Europe, when lawyers, cosmopolitan lawyers, would get up and say, we will not tolerate polygyny in Europe. And I thought, what is that about? Europeans tolerate mistresses. Mitterrand, Berlusconi. At least if you're a legal wife, you have legal rights. Then somebody else stood up and said, we will not tolerate the scarf in Europe. And I thought, what's that about? Bizarre. It is bizarre. And a man came over to me, and I said it was bizarre. And he said, Professor Nader, you tell the truth, but sometimes that's not a good idea. I asked him if it was a threat, and he walked away. You all remember the Botero exhibit that came here to Berkeley. You must remember it did not come to the art museum. It came to a library. Botero was shocked by the Abu Ghraib tortures, and all the way back to Paris, he thought about it, and he spent months drawing torture pictures. And they showed here in Berkeley, and he gave the whole collection to the university. No other art museum, period, in the country would show his pictures, his paintings. Why? Then there was President Ahmadinejad of Iran, who gave a talk at Columbia at the invitation of the students. He was introduced by the president of Columbia University in a most insulting way. He called him a cruel dictator. He insulted him for 15 minutes before Ahmadinejad came to the podium. This is all in the New York Times. President Ahmadinejad came to the podium and he said, we do not treat our guests this way in Iran. We do not tell the students what they should think of the speaker. We treat the students and the guest with respect. Makes you think, who's the barbarian? But I also said that the process of thinking about culture and dignity was over many decades. The year I came home from second grade and asked my mother, why don't Arabs treat their women better? Second grade, I was being told that. And my mother, who was a teacher, was indignant. And she said, when you grow up, you will realize that Americans treat their women worse than anywhere in the Arab world. That was a challenge. My parents immigrated from Levant, Greater Syria it was. My father gave his word that he would bring my mother back to see her parents. So in 1937, for my third grade, my mother and her 4 children boarded the USS Excambians and sailed out of New York City for Beirut. 1937, mind you. War was about to break out. Exciting 3-week trip for a young girl, culminating in Beirut before French customs. I recall vividly my mother, a teacher, an American citizen, was disrespected by the customs agent because of her place of origin. We remember such things for years. I remember that forever. My father had left Lebanon after the French colonizers took over, because either he had to stay and join the resistance, or he had to immigrate to support his widowed mother and sister. So he had come to the land of the free for the unfree, and he took American democracy very seriously. When we entered Lebanese villages in 37, 38, the villagers were in total respect. The Americans are coming, the Americans are coming. Bring me my gold bracelets, they would say. Admiration. So that was my memory of how the Middle East, that part of the Middle East, saw the United States. The land of the free for the unfree. The next trip was not until summer 1961. There had been more violence, 1958. South Lebanon was where I worked with the Shia Muslims, and the Israelis were already infiltrating into South Lebanon. The Civil War then came about, and there was no more field work for me in the Middle East until 1980, when I went to Morocco, and I spent a summer working on a language project. 1985, 2005, I was invited to lecture at the American University of Cairo. These were, they're the core of my book. But in between, I went to conferences in Saudi Arabia. I was invited to be the first woman invited to a conference of all men in Saudi Arabia, and I told them my modesty would not prevent me to be the only woman among men, and they asked me if I wanted to bring somebody, and so I invited Professor Tripp to go with me. The same thing happened when I went to a conference in Damascus on science and technology. They wrote me and said I was the only lady to be invited. I wrote them back and I said, I may be the only lady, but there are any other women coming. They immediately understood, and they invited other women. At that time exactly, I was a member of a National Academy of Sciences committee on nuclear, and I was one of 300, the rest were men. And I said to them, why am I the only woman in this conference? There are a lot of women scientists, physicists, and so on. They just said, you seem to be handling it pretty well, Laura. They didn't do what they had done, either in Saudi Arabia or in Damascus. So, the subtitle of my book is called Dialogues Between the Middle East and the West. This is anathema to most publishers even. Why? Why would they think that dialogues was anathema? Because of area studies. We have courses on this campus in every university around. African studies, Middle Eastern studies, Latin American studies. They're mostly defined by the military. And so when you want to talk about dialogues between two areas, the publishers don't know quite what to do with your book. Where are they going to put it? In European studies or in Middle Eastern studies? I mean, who's going to deal with this? So the notion of bounded areas is misleading. The Middle East, the middle of what? East of where? So my second chapter after the introduction, I decided to take a look at those Middle Easterners who had traveled west, in this case to Europe. Europe had been visited by travelers and traders for centuries from the Middle East. A most famous example is Ibn Fadlan, who in 922 AD was sent by his caliph in Baghdad to Russia, where on his way up the Volga, he encountered Scandinavian traders. The missionary for Islam met merchants whose customs deeply impressed him as barbarians in need of civilization. The dirtiest creatures of God, he said, and body and manners. Shocking mostly was the burial of their chief, which he witnessed, and the custom for those traders was to bury a woman alive with their chief. They burned them both. Similar critiques appeared written by Arab historians of the Crusades a few centuries later, 11th, 12th, 13th century. They saw themselves as culturally superior to the West, or the Fringe they called them. But they knew that the West was technologically superior. Although they were technologically superior, these historians say, these Westerners, these Fringe, knew mainly blood, torture, and cannibalism. And that view is very deep. Not so long ago, maybe a decade ago, a group of Moroccan governors came to Berkeley, and I got to meet them. The one who spoke English the best, we got into an argument about light water reactors, nuclear reactors on the coast of Morocco. I said, why are you taking old French nuclear reactors and putting them on the coast? You don't even have the infrastructure to deal with it. And he tried to convince me, and I wouldn't be convinced, and finally he was so irritated. He said to me, the French, they have no culture, they have no civilization, but they have technology. So that's an old view. It's not just the Middle East that thinks that. There are many other civilizations who focus on the fact that the West is not true, of course, from our point of view, but that is a view. And so much of what I began to notice is that they're seeing us like we see them. We see them like barbarians, they see us like barbarians. So in the second chapter, I focus on a man named Al-Tahtawi. After Napoleon's unilateral invasion of Egypt, 1798, El-Tatawi was sent on a scientific mission, the first scientific mission, sent to the West by Egypt's modernizer, Muhammad Ali. From 1826 to 1831, he studied the French while he learned the art of translation. He published his book on the French, their politics, their culture, their technology, their science, and more, in 1834. It was translated to English in 2004. At the same time as he was studying the French, the British anthropologist, whatever you want to call him, Edward Lane, was in Cairo writing his book on the customs and manners of the modern Egyptians. It was published in 1836. But the style of the two men was different, and I want to focus on this for a minute. Lane used scientific objectivity. He looked at the people of Cairo, but objectivity was his method. El-Tatawi uses an objective subjectivity. So Lane deliberately hides himself. El-Tatawi tells you what he's thinking. For example, he says the French have cleaner baths than we do. They're not quite as good as ours because they're not steam, and steam baths are better for you. Right? So then he also notices a martyr, the body of a martyr, located in a museum. And he comments, they don't have any respect. They respect animals more than they respect human beings. They didn't even give them a decent burial. They brought him back from Egypt and put him in a museum. So you can see. But he admired their science and technology. And he reminds us all the way through, remember the precursor, because he knows that one civilization gives to the next civilization. We're all munching on each other. Because he's interested in language, he points out that all the elegance of Arabic disappears with translation. But throughout his work, he's interested in what humans everywhere share. That's what's so interesting. We are all humans. What do we all share? And 100 years later, plus, Edward Said writes Orientalism, the book that caused an intellectual storm. Said was an Arab, a Palestinian, with an English accent, critiquing European writings about the Orient. In 1980, I remember Sam Huntington, Edward Said, and myself were at a Washington think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. It was before Sam Huntington wrote The Clash of Cultures, and the subject was, can cultures communicate? And Said was arguing that the other is not mute, because we always treat the other, even the anthropologists during a period said we have to give the other the voice. Well, the other has a fine voice. Just listen to what the other is saying. So the other is not mute. By chapter 3, I have my own critique of anthropology, the unstated consensus that protects a certain way of studying others. It's somehow lesser than Euro-Americans. A critique best articulated by British anthropologist Sir Edmund Leach. He says there is no modern opposed to primitive society. We are all rational, and the other is interesting for understanding ourselves. And this relates to how we study the Middle Eastern peoples today. We are cotemporal, contemporary with each other. All of this caused me to ask, what do people actually mean when they say that Islamic women are oppressed? To whom are these women being compared? Recently, I was invited to give a talk at Hayward State. It has a different name today. And first time I've ever been asked to comment on a cartoon. The cartoon they sent me had this woman dressed in black on one side, and this woman dressed like you see on the campuses around the country, high spiked, heels, very short skirt, breasts hanging out. And the woman covered looks at the other woman, she says, poor thing, her men make her go bare. And this woman looks at this woman and says, poor thing, her men make her get covered. Mm-hmm. And they wanted me to discuss it. What surprised me was when I came in the room, totally co-ed. It wasn't just women and feminists that wanted to understand this. So this whole notion of somehow our women are better than they, which is an open question, treated better. So I wrote a piece called Orientalism, Occidentalism, and the Control of Women. It came out in 1989. Couldn't get it published in the United States. It was published in Belgium. And it was about how images of women in other societies can be prejudicial to women in one's own society. So for example, we say they don't treat their women well, but they do the same thing. So we can say, you think it's bad here? You want to go be a Muslim in Afghanistan or someplace? Look at what's happening to Afghanistan women. And they say the same thing on TV. You want to be like the American woman? Look at the rape rate in their universities. They don't even get equal pay. They don't even get maternity leave, all of which is true because they're using feminist literature to document what they're saying. So it's fascinating, and I first came upon this sort of notion when I was in Sudan giving a talk to what would be their HEW. They wanted me to talk about the state of American women. And we have been very successful in telling the world that American women have it really great. People believe that. And so what they do is they develop their policies based on what they hear that American women are like, not on the reality sometimes. So here in Sudan, they had equal pay by law. They had maternity leave. Same in Morocco. They had equal numbers. So, to them, it was bizarre what I was saying. I had 3 kids at Berkeley, never had a day of maternity leave. So and I never had equal pay to this day. So how you portray women in other patriarchal societies is used to control the women in their own. And sometimes it's kind of interesting. My mother was 95 years old. She was sitting in a chair in one of our living rooms at home, and the TV was showing all this argument about abortion. She wanted to know what the argument was. What is this about? And I'm not sure I should pay attention, but I can't help it. Remember the last election when various congressmen were saying things like, talking about what is rape and what is not rape, and should women, these were men talking about women in public. Never would happen in a Middle Eastern country. And when I explained to my mother what the whole abortion issue was, she sat up very straight, 95 years old, and she said, "Not their business." And why did she do that? Because in that part of the world, the state does not get involved in personal issues like that. They're may be covered by religious laws or whatever, but you don't get involved, the governments don't get involved in such things. So recently there was a study at Yale about scientists. And the interesting thing there were some people from other cultures, and they were saying that the problem with American science today is that only about 12% in most sciences are women. Very small percentage, scientists. And they were breaking them down, microbiology and physics and so on. And there was a woman from Jordan there, a biologist, and she said, in Jordan it's about 50-50. So we really need comparisons. It's really comparisons. We need to stop being so ignorant about what's going on in different places. And what's interesting is that at the highest level in our country, Hillary Clinton, could you get a better education than Hillary Clinton? You remember when the Egyptian army took this woman by the hair and pulled her into the streets, and she said, she talks to people in other countries like they're all children. You should learn to treat your women better. She didn't even know it happened at Berkeley the week before. The head of the Townsend Center was grabbed by the hair and given to the police. But the different reaction was In Cairo, the next day, 10,000 women marched. In Berkeley, there were 8 of us. That was it. 8 professors to discuss what to do about this situation. 10,000 women in Cairo, 8 in Berkeley. All right, so I want to say a few words about a chapter that's very difficult called Corporate Fundamentalism, Constructing Children in the U.S. and Elsewhere. For a number of years in the late 1970s, I served on the Carnegie Council on Children. Our general conclusion was the following. When parents feel powerless, it is not because they need reform, therapy, or education, but because they are relatively powerless in today's society. On the book jacket it said, "All Our Children" is a book that must be read by everyone who wants to restore the traditional primacy of the family in American life. The Carnegie people pointed out also, we must have corporations with a high sense of social responsibility, even when the exercise of that responsibility produces no new profits or increase in the rate of corporate growth. Fine. Christopher Lasch said something like that early on. He talked about how public policies and business impinged on the family, which is now no longer a haven in a heartless world. And he specified how corporate capitalism expropriates parental authority. This is happening worldwide now. So when you hear about Islamic fundamentalism, it's not as if it's not related to corporate fundamentalism or evangelicalism in the United States. It's interesting. When Lasch made the argument that the use of narcissistic tactics by corporations that create insecurities among the young that marketers then exploit, we've got this very well documented now. I want to take you way back in history. Hammurabi's Code, 1750 BC. You know what it said on this issue? Selling to minors is punishable by death. 1750 BC. So when we speak about Islamic fundamentalism, you've got to tie it to what's coming in, apart from bombs or anything else that's coming in. With the death of President Nasser in 70, President Sadat changed the Egyptian economy that opened the door to foreign investment. And all of a sudden, same thing under President Mubarak. And everything changed. The shift was from socialism to corporate colonialism. And in Egypt, we had the appearance then of new forms of Islamic dress that came in at the same time. So women started to cover themselves. Do the two things have anything to do with one another? One person who does work on that part of the world said this open door policy evoked a siege mentality. So by 2011, the Arab Spring, we can connect youth, wars, violence, and fundamentalism. And in this chapter, I argue that corporate fundamentalism has triggered the rise of non-Western religious fundamentalisms all over the world. Not just the Middle East, Korea, India, China, and so forth. Now, let me give you an example of how this affects families and the siege mentality. President George W. Bush wanted to win the hearts and minds of Muslims. We put millions into that. One researcher studying observed the new curriculum that came out of this in Jordan. No history, classes in entrepreneurship, and you see them here all over the place. How to be good business people. Is that bad? At semester end, a young man is asked if he had saved 500 dinars, and the neighbor's house burned down, and the neighbor asked him for a 400 dinar loan. What would he do? He said, I'd give it to him. Wrong, says the teacher. You should plow ahead with your business plan. But he says, my neighbor is my uncle. So, priorities shift from family to neoliberal principles. And this affects how people react and the unsettling. In Morocco, one of my colleagues calls this phenomena the burning. The kids are not related to their parents anymore, and this is the prime unit in this part of the world, the family. It's the prime unit, not the couple, the family. And so you destroy the family, and there's a huge threat. The last part of my book deals with nonviolence and its opposite. It deals with human rights, the politics of silence, which certainly involves the U.S.-Israeli connection. In my 1985 AUC lecture on the seeds of nonviolence in the Middle East, the audience imagination they were so excited by this whole notion. For they had come to believe that they were violent. They believed in the stereotypes. In this part of the world, historically, non-government controls are traditionally primary, not police. When we were in Morocco and Ramadan started, it was interesting because we looked at the beaches the day before Ramadan. They were full of people, and I said to my children, tomorrow we'll have the beach to ourselves. The next day there wasn't a person on the beach, and we couldn't go to the beach either. There were no police, but the control, public opinion. So the conference that Sue Tripp and I went to had to do with the pilgrimage in Mecca, the Hajj. This brings people in the thousands from all over the world, and it's performed without conflict traditionally. Shame and crowd control, very powerful. But the study of Arabs as stereotypically violent, along with Latin Americans, there's now a growing literature on how this happens. And we've looked at, people in this room, in fact, probably have looked at the stereotyping of Arabs in American cinema, with, for example, Israelis being played by popular American actors while the Arabs are portrayed as cruel terrorists. And now we can see how this propaganda works and with what consequence. It may seem obvious to say, but countries, cultures, and societies are not born violent. They may evolve towards violence or towards peaceful behavior during different periods. Under Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedes ravaged Europe and killed thousands. Now we see Swedes as peacemakers and peace-oriented. The Jew as a people belonged to a humanistic tradition until Hitler unleashed his murderous policies, which then led to the development of Jewish nationalism associated with Zionism and the formation of what Anthony Nutting calls a Western beachhead in the Middle East called Israel. The Israeli state now has military might, third probably greatest military state in the world, nuclear warheads, so forth. The Egyptians were peaceful until the 20th century when they built up their military. And the U.S. may point the finger, but Euro-American nations have created the most devastating war technologies the human species has ever seen, ever known. And they're the major players in the arms trade. Now, in the occupied territories, the Palestinians use nonviolent tactics for obvious reasons. In the Golan Heights, they used nonviolent tactics, and they got shot by the Israelis. And now new attention is being given to nonviolence. Humiliation by dictators or by imperialist powers sabotages dignity, and we are hearing this from one end of the Arab world to the other, and even in our country, about our country and our dignity. So we need to break the silence, the double standard. Although the silences have multiple causes, national security, Christianity versus Islam, the impact of Zionist ideology, the most worrying for me is desensitization. Desensitization to forms of war that mean we'll never have to face up to war, or the passive violence that follows. Cowardly wars, I call them. Vengeance. The killing of Osama bin Laden was not justice, it was vengeance. We used to associate vengeance with the barbarians. Dissent is silenced here and elsewhere through ideology, political and religious, through racism, self-interest, and so forth. And after 9/11, people asked, why do they hate us? And those who wrote trying to explain got angry responses. Gaza is the largest jail in the world, and it's tolerated by the world. Desensitization is what occurred in Nazi Germany. It allowed genocide to proceed unnoticed. as with the unconcern of the consequences of one-sided military action in Libya, Sudan, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq. There cannot be serious knowledge about a region of the world when there are so many taboos and myths. We have to break the silence, and these I try to do in my book. Prior to the Iraq War, initiated by George W. Bush, the silence was broken, but by too few. Same is happening with President Obama's drone wars. Nobody talked about that much during the elections. Drones, they're going to come back to haunt us. The ignorance is something that's unforgivable because we have one of the best education systems in the world. Who knows that before the Iraq War, Iraq had a stable middle class, the largest in the Arab world. It had universal education and health care. It had women who had achieved in their professional lives. And it was a dictatorship that did horrible things. The Iraqs now have been decimated, humiliated, dignity erased, and now we have to deal with Obama's kill list, which he brags. He's a constitutional lawyer. Biden is a constitutional lawyer. They know better. So I want to end with what I had in my final chapter. It's called Lessons. And there's a Tanzanian jurisprudence professor named Shivji. And he was so upset by the U.S. and Britain going into Iraq that he stopped from going to a conference he was supposed to go to in London. Instead, he wrote a very interesting piece that appeared in the internet. And he said, Western civilization's claim to universalization owes much to the argument of force rather than the force of argument. Then he goes on to say we have to weave a new tapestry for the planet. The enlightened were acting like the barbarians of the past. The arrogance of power is blinding. And the travelers from the East opened windows. They searched for common points of reference and the possibilities for coexistence. Remember the precursor as well as the innovator, Al-Tatawi said. Lessons in culture and dignity involve both. The potential for technological destruction creates unease. The manufacturing of a lifestyle in which family loyalties become brand loyalties is disharmonic westernization. It's not good for any people. A lot of this stuff, the video games and so forth, would be considered by Hammurabi as child abuse many thousands of years ago. Humiliation of the enemy, it's a bad idea. So we need to think of connections. And I just want to end by reading my last paragraph. Macro history, and we desperately need world history courses all over the place. Macro history means we can use knowledge of culture and environment to learn something of value to ourselves. The Middle East probably has the longest recorded history of any geographic area. It's a place where cereals were first domesticated. It has a history of progressively deteriorating environment. Out of the world's 15 most water-scarce countries, 12 are in the Middle East today. So how, over the years, have people learned to cope? How did they adjust to soil erosion, deforestation, lowered water registers? Having the first cities accompanied by specialization and centralization, how did they manage inequalities? Natives tell us that urban inequalities were mitigated by what they call levelers, as with the urban use of veiling. If everybody veils, you can't tell who's rich and who's poor. In the Sudan, you have the ubiquitous wearing of all-white garments by rich and poor. There were rules against boasting behavior, rules embedded in evil eye beliefs. Peace between religious groups nourished philosophies of coexistence. In the Damascus market, you have 3 different sections of the market: the Jewish section, the Christian section, and the Muslim section. And whenever you have your Sabbath, that part of the market is closed. But coexistence, that's what that means. Automatic controls such as shame may be survival techniques. In other words, collective attempts emerge to deal with collective problems. All people can benefit from the study of others, especially as all people address planetary problems of climate change, violence, wars over resources, population displacements. In this way of looking at the world, there is no us and them. Thank you very much.